Well, with that in mind, the US House of Representatives passing that bill that would force the Chinese company ByteDance to divest from the social media giant TikTok. Joining us now on the implications of this legislation are Shahzad Qazi, China Beige Book International Managing Director, and Colin Costello, Freshfield's CFIUS and National Security Advisor. Welcome to you both here. Now, obviously, going into this, when we saw that House panel first have that, no opposition to this, we did expect it at least to still have that support in the House. Shahzad, I want to start with you, though. In terms of the support that we might see then as we head to the Senate, is there the same appetite for this here?
Well, definitely not. The House was very clear that this was going to pass, given the amount of work over the last year and a half that the Select Committee Chair and Ranking Member Mike Gallagher and Raja Krishnamurthy have put in behind the scenes. The Senate is a different ballgame, and it's pretty much up in the air right now whether it passes. I think how former President Trump potentially changes his stance, if he softens up, I think it has a good chance of passing. But if his opposition remains firm, this may just die in the Senate.
Colin, this is something that you're very familiar with, given your involvement during the Trump administration. I realize you can't weigh in specifically on the ban that was proposed under that administration, but at the core of the debate over the years with TikTok, it has been about the national security concern, the data collection that happens on the app. Is this about evidence that points to the Chinese government having used that data, or is it about the potential risk that could come with allowing that? In other words, there's not necessarily the evidence, but the potential of that is really high.
Certainly. So if you look at how the government understands national security risk, it really looks at it in terms of three variables. Those are threat, vulnerability, and consequence. And so the threat is going to be the foreign person, in this case, ByteDance. The vulnerability is going to be some aspect of the U.S. business, the U.S. operations of TikTok that might make it susceptible to exploitation by a foreign adversary. And then the consequence is how those two variables are going to interact with one another. And here, given that depending on whose estimates you believe, TikTok has between 150 and 170 million US users, that consequence of exploitation could be potentially quite enormous. So previously, the focus seems to have been on reducing the vulnerability of TikTok. This is what has been done by TikTok in terms of what they call Project Texas, working with Oracle. But apparently the Congress has determined that that's not moving fast enough. And so they're going to now try to address the threat aspect of this, which is to say they are going to force ByteDance to divest TikTok or else face effectively a ban in the US, thereby removing the threat actor. And I think from the perspective of the government, whether or not they have access to classified information that suggests that this app has been used by the Chinese government to obtain information, the latent capability exists simply because the Chinese government does have broad legal authorities to compel cooperations in matters of national security. So from the perspective of someone who views the Chinese government as an adversary, and as a very capable adversary, the question is not has it been used, but can it be used? And the answer to that, I think, from the perspective of the people who wrote this bill is yes.
Colin, let's suppose that this bill does, in fact, pass the Senate as well. And that's a big if, obviously, the way Shahzad has laid it out. What are the legal challenges or legal avenues that TikTok can fight this?
Well, certainly we saw the challenges that were brought against the 2020 executive order by Donald Trump, which was promulgated pursuant to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and ultimately fell because it ran afoul of the personal communications exception and the informational materials exceptions. This bill is really designed, I think, to get around that. The IEPA is quite flexible in terms of a grant of authority, but it's not infinitely flexible. And certainly the courts found that in relation to the 2020 executive order. What this is doing is providing effectively an independent authority for the executive branch to review foreign adversary controlled applications, so defined, and effect a divestiture if they find that they represent a threat to national security. Other challenges obviously could be brought under the First Amendment of the Constitution, and I think that will likely turn on the extent to which this is viewed as content neutral.
And Shahzad, I want to bring you in here because when you think about retaliation, I mean, the Chinese government has already said it does not support this divestiture. Could we be stuck in a tit for tat? And what would be the most likely targets? Something perhaps that would be the equivalent of, say, a TikTok in China?
Yeah, pulling back, I think the idea is that in Beijing now, you have what I like to call a minus America policy, which is where, when it comes to things like supply chains, et cetera, we talk about having a China plus one strategy. China shouldn't be the only provider. But when it comes to the Chinese government, especially in the area of technology, whether it's hardware, software programs, so forth, but beyond technology too, they want American businesses and American providers completely extricated. And of course, in China, we have a very broad, developing definition of what could potentially construe a national security threat. It's very unclear, which means that a bunch of targets are open for retaliation. Of course, the social media companies don't exist out there, American ones, essentially, so they're out. But, it's very likely that they go after some kind of high-profile target, nevertheless, in maybe a different industry, maybe a different space, and not necessarily a direct equivalent, such as in the tech space, as they've done in the past when they went after Bain, et cetera. So I think some kind of high-profile target or retaliation is absolutely going to be in the cards to the extent that this becomes all successful and we're able to take on ByteDance and perhaps if TikTok is banned.
And Colin, obviously, what counts as a national security risk, obviously that's something that can be subjective. But what about the idea that perhaps some of the concerns here can't be addressed any other way other than divestiture or a ban? Will that stand up to legal scrutiny?
It's difficult to say. I mean, the purpose of the law is, of course, to be narrowly tailored to address the specific national security risks that would arise from the foreign adversary control over the application in question. Here, the attempts by the Congress is to make certain that when this is, or if this is challenged, I should say, and I think when this is challenged, that they can demonstrate that this is motivated by a specific national security risk. It is narrowly tailored to address that risk. As we've been saying, it is not a ban, effectively, or per se. Rather, it is just a choice. It is a choice to divest or die, effectively, not be able to distribute your product within the United States. And I think in trying to characterize it there, as opposed to just as a direct ban of a particular and specific product, the Congress is hoping to avoid challenges that might arise on the basis that it is not narrowly tailored enough to the specific risk that's been identified.
Shahzad, you mentioned the potential for retaliation against American companies. I can't help but think about what's been playing out with Apple and their iPhones. When you hear the language that is coming out on why government employees have not been allowed to use it, it's very similar, right? To say that it's an American company, they could potentially have a backdoor, they could potentially be collecting data on Chinese users. How does the Chinese government deal with this at a time when they are trying to attract more foreign investment into the country, when things have slowed down? It's sort of trying to find this balance between countering what the U.S. is doing, but at the same time saying we're still open for business.
Yeah, I think I would say this is classic China policy. It's asking for foreign investment in areas where China needs the foreign capital, or more importantly, needs the foreign know-how. Think of any number of chip makers, the equipment they supply, or anything related to semiconductors. But in other places where China has been able to successfully help homegrown companies through a range of subsidies and policies help become powerful and take on the foreign companies, and the competitors as they're seen now, China's more than happy to, increasingly get rid of them. So we've seen this play out over the better part of the last 20 years.
Finally, Colin, you say that there hasn't really been a precedent for something like this. When you think about the way in which Congress is trying to take this action to effectively ban TikTok, what would be the legal implications? What's the fallout from this beyond TikTok? Because there are plenty of apps out there. There's plenty of Chinese companies that are looking to make entry into the U.S. and other foreign countries or other foreign companies as well.
Certainly. I mean, the TikTok is the focus right now because it's the shiny object, but the bill is much broader than just TikTok. TikTok is just the example that the bill puts forward as sort of the first use case of the legislation. If passed as written, this would grant the president a very broad authority to identify sort of so-defined foreign adversary controlled applications ranging from websites to mobile apps to desktop apps, and then with a degree of notice, force a divestiture. There are questions here in terms of what does this mean? And for companies' willingness to host applications that are coming, for example, out of China. If they fear that perhaps in the future they're going to be deemed a foreign adversary controlled application, and now the company who's hosting that application is going to face potential fines, potentially enormous fines, if they continue to host the application. I think there's also implications for open questions about CFIUS jurisdiction. If CFIUS has reviewed, for example, a foreign acquisition of a U.S. business and cleared it, it's cleared it with safe harbor, which means that CFIUS can't re-review the transaction. I think, as written, there's an open question as to whether or not a CFIUS grant of safe harbor could effectively be overruled by this bill, by the president making a finding under this law that a foreign adversary controlled app poses a threat to national security. Even if CFIUS in the past has previously reviewed and cleared a transaction, the president could then come over the top because it's not being conducted under a CFIUS authority, it's an independent legislative authority, and effectively force the divestiture that CFIUS has already approved. So I think that there's a lot of open questions here and potentially much broader implications just beyond TikTok.
Okay, we'll be watching all these developments play out. Great to have both of you on today. Shahzad Qazi and Colin Costello. Appreciate the time.